Okay, so we are going to talk about grain. When fabric is woven, it has threads that go in a north-south direction, and these are called the warp threads. They are rolled onto a roll, and then there is a shuttle that goes across in a west to east direction that weaves in and out of them like this to create the fabric. These threads are called the weft threads. So when you purchase fabric, you buy it off a roll like this, by the meter, which is rolled off the roll onto the table. Fabric's been constructed in this way that I've just described. So as the fabric is rolled off the roll with your pattern all over it, you can see that the long threads running down the long edge of the fabric are your warp threads, and the threads running from side to side of the fabric are your weft threads. There are two finished edges down each side of the fabric as it comes off the roll. There's one here that I'm showing you. They tend, if there's a printed fabric, the print won't go right up to the edge, and they tend to have a little fluffy edge, but they don't fray. These are called the salve edges, and the salve edge is indicative of the warp. So you'll have your salve edge going down this edge here and this edge here. Because of the way that threads are woven together like this, if you're pulling in a north-south direction, the fabric won't move, and if you pull in a west-east direction, the fabric won't move. Those two directions indicate the most stable part of a woven fabric, such as quilter's cotton, which I've got under here. The true grain of a fabric is parallel with the warp threads, and every pattern piece that you use will have a double-headed arrow that looks a little bit like this, which would indicate the true grain. So if you are cutting out a project, which we're about to do, you would see where the double-headed arrow is and lie that parallel to the salve edge in order to make sure that the pattern piece is lined up with the most stable part of the fabric. On the projects that we use in this course, you don't have to be completely true to the warp thread grain because we're using very stable quilter's cotton fabrics as outlined in the materials list. So there is actually a cross grain, which is the weft grain as well. And sometimes if you're buying fat quarters, there is no salvage for you to be able to identify where the warp grain is and where the weft grain is, or where the normal grain and cross grain lie in the fabric. And the only way you can determine where the grain is to look at the back of the fabric if it's a printed fabric, and zoom in really closely with your eyes or a magnifying glass, and you'll be able to see. It might be easier with, do I have another piece of fabric? Yeah. You'll be able to see where the threads are actually woven into the fabric in the direction that they go. And as long as your project templates, the double-headed arrow on your project templates are lying parallel with the threads running in either direction of your fabric, then you are on a grain line. I'll just demonstrate that with this piece. So if I pull across, there's no give in that fabric really, because I'm pulling right along the thread line. And if I pull along the width, there's no give because I'm pulling along the thread line. Those two directions are your grain lines. There is one other direction that you need to know about, and that is a 45-degree angle along the warp and the weft, and this is called the bias. When you pull on a 45-degree angle against the grain, you have a lot of stretch in your fabric. This is where the fabric is least stable. We'll recap this as we move through the course, but it's useful to know that that's what bias means and why you need to lay pattern pieces on the grain. The grain line is denoted on your pattern pieces because the person that's designed the pattern wants you to lay the pattern in the most stable place of the fabric so that you can get a neat and precise cut and finish to the product that you're making. If you go off grain, or you go completely off piece and you cut on the bias, you will find that your fabric distorts in ways that make your project unpredictable while you're constructing it. So it's really important to examine your fabric if you have no salve edges to be able to identify where the grain line lies.